Texas is the only U.S. state that existed as an independent country. For nearly a decade, it printed its own currency, maintained embassies, and signed treaties with France and Britain. When Texas joined the Union in 1845, it wasn't absorbed from territory like every other state. It negotiated annexation as a sovereign equal. That single fact explains almost everything strange about Texas today. But the real reason Texas is the opposite of every other state has nothing to do with pride or attitude. It has to do with a paradox that exists nowhere else on Earth. Before Texas could become this paradox, it had to become a country. And the revolution that made it one wasn't what most people think. The Texas Revolution wasn't Americans fighting Mexicans. It was Federalists fighting Centralists. When General Santa Anna seized power in Mexico City and dissolved the federal constitution, he didn't just anger Anglo settlers, he infuriated Mexican Texans who had built their lives under that constitution's promises. Tejanos fought alongside Anglo colonists at every major battle, not as traitors to Mexico, but as defenders of the federalism Mexico had abandoned. The famous "Come and Take It" flag that flew at Gonzales in October 1835 wasn't anti-Mexican defiance. It was anti-authoritarian protest, a message to any government that tried to disarm citizens who had been promised the right to bear arms. The cannon the settlers refused to surrender had been given to them by Mexico itself years earlier for defense against Comanche raids. The revolution succeeded not because of American firepower, but because of a single catastrophic mistake. At the Battle of San Jacinto, Santa Anna made an error that changed North American history. His army camped in an open prairie with their backs to a bayou, confident the ragtag Texan force posed no real threat. On the afternoon of April 21, 1836, while Mexican soldiers rested during siesta, Sam Houston's forces crept through tall grass and attacked without warning. The entire engagement lasted 18 minutes. Mexican soldiers, caught between charging Texans and the water behind them, had nowhere to flee. Santa Anna himself was captured the next day hiding in a marsh, wearing a private's uniform in a desperate attempt to avoid recognition. Under duress, and likely fearing for his life, he signed the Treaty of Velasco, granting Texas independence. Mexico's Congress refused to recognize those treaties. They called them illegitimate, signed by a prisoner, not a president. That refusal created a legal limbo that would trigger a full-scale war within a decade. But before that war came, Texas had already begun building something that would outlast any treaty. The Tejanos who fought in that revolution weren't just soldiers defending constitutional rights. They were the people who invented everything Americans think of as cowboy culture. This is the part most people never learn. Rodeos, roping, cattle drives, the wide-brimmed hat, the pointed boots, the leather chaps. All of it was invented by Mexican vaqueros centuries before Anglo settlers crossed the Sabine River. Spanish mission records from the 1700s document vaqueros at San Antonio de Valero herding thousands of cattle across South Texas 300 years before the American Wild West existed as a concept. At Mission San Jose, vaqueros managed herds of 5,000 sheep and 1,500 cattle using techniques they had refined over generations. They developed the riata, the braided leather rope that became the American lasso. They designed saddles with horns for roping, stirrups for stability, and cantlebacks for long rides across open range. The equipment, the methods, the entire culture of working cattle on horseback, none of it came from the American East. Anglo settlers who arrived in the 1820s and 1830s didn't invent ranching. They enrolled in it, learning from vaqueros who had been perfecting the craft since before the United States existed. The word rodeo itself comes from the Spanish charreada, the competitive displays of horsemanship that vaqueros performed at roundups. By 1929, American rodeos had formalized rules borrowed directly from these Mexican traditions. The transformation was so complete that most Americans today have no idea the cowboy they picture, the symbol of rugged American individualism, is actually Mexican heritage preserved in amber. This is why Texas has a 40% Hispanic population today. It was always binational. The Lone Star State's most iconic symbols aren't American inventions adopted by Mexicans. They're Mexican inventions adopted by Americans. And that cultural fusion happened because Texas was never fully Southern, never fully Western, never fully anything except itself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into what makes Texas different, subscribe. There's a lot more to uncover. Texas has 53 Fortune 500 headquarters, more than any state in the country. Apple is expanding there. Samsung built the largest semiconductor plant in America there. Tesla moved its headquarters there. Yet Texas charges zero corporate income tax and zero personal income tax. Only 5 states lack personal income tax. No other state lacks both corporate and personal income tax simultaneously. This seems economically impossible. How do you fund the second largest state in the nation without taxing income? The answer is buried underground. Texas's no income tax policy dates to the 19th century, back when oil was just beginning to reshape the state's economy. Once the policy took hold, it became self-reinforcing. Businesses relocated for the tax advantage. Population grew. Political will to implement new taxes never materialized because voters had never known anything different, and because the state discovered it didn't need their income. Texas runs on property taxes, sales taxes, and one crucial revenue stream that no other state can match: severance taxes on oil and gas extraction. Every barrel pumped from Texas soil generates revenue for the state government. Every cubic foot of natural gas pulled from the Permian Basin pays its share. The state doesn't need your income tax because it's sitting on the largest oil fields in North America. But here's where Texas becomes truly strange. The state that produces 42% of America's crude oil also produces more wind and solar power than any other state, nearly double California's renewable output. This is the fact that makes Texas genuinely impossible to categorize. In 2024, Texas pumped a record 2 billion barrels of crude oil. The Permian Basin alone contains 20 of the nation's top 100 oil fields. Drilling rigs dot the West Texas landscape like mechanical grasshoppers, pumping around the clock, feeding pipelines that crisscross the state. If Texas were an independent country, it would rank among OPEC members in production. The state accounts for 96% of recent U.S. oil production growth. When people talk about American energy independence, they're really talking about Texas. And simultaneously, in the same state, often in the same counties, Texas generates 169,000 gigawatt hours of wind and solar power annually. That's not just first place. That's nearly double California's 92,000 gigawatt hours. Drive through the Panhandle and you'll see wind turbines stretching to the horizon in every direction, their blades turning in the constant prairie wind. Solar capacity alone has increased 800% since 2019. Panels now carpet former ranch land across West Texas, converting the same relentless sunshine that once just baked the earth. The flat, windy Panhandle became America's wind corridor, not through environmental activism or green mandates. It happened through the same market logic that built the oil industry: cheap land, loose regulation, and profit motive. In 2005, Texas passed legislation enabling massive transmission infrastructure for renewable energy, not because legislators wanted to save the planet, but because they saw a business opportunity. Wind turbines make money. In Texas, that's all the justification anyone needs. The result is a contradiction that exists nowhere else on Earth. Texas is both the fossil fuel capital and the renewable energy capital of the United States. The same state dominates both sides of the energy debate. Oil executives and wind farm developers operate under the same flag, often invest in each other's industries, and both pay severance taxes that fund the same state government. This isn't hypocrisy, it's Texas. Fort Worth and Dallas sit 32 miles apart in the same metropolitan area. They share airports, highways, and sports teams. But stand in the Fort Worth stockyards on a Saturday afternoon watching cowboys drive longhorn cattle down Exchange Avenue like they've done for over a century, and you could swear you're in a different state than the one visible from the Dallas Arts District, where glass towers house corporate headquarters and world-class museums fill entire city blocks. How did two completely opposite cultures grow up side by side? Fort Worth and Dallas are just the most visible example. Texas isn't one place, it's at least four. Drive east from Dallas and you enter the piney woods, a landscape that looks exactly like Georgia or Mississippi. Humid air, dense forests, small towns where accents sound distinctly deep south. This is East Texas, and culturally it belongs to the old Confederacy as much as anywhere in Alabama. Now drive west, far west, to El Paso. The city sits closer to San Diego than to Houston. The desert landscape, the architecture, the cultural feel. This is the Southwest, not the South. El Paso has more in common with Tucson than with any city east of the Pecos. Between those extremes lies the hill country, where German immigrants settled in the 19th century and built towns like Fredericksburg and New Braunfels. The architecture, the food, the family names, generations later, the German heritage remains visible everywhere. Churches hold services in German, bakeries sell strudel alongside breakfast tacos, and south along the Rio Grande, the valley is majority Hispanic, Spanish-speaking, and culturally binational in ways that would feel foreign to someone from East Texas. Families cross the border for dinner. Business happens in two languages. The international boundary feels more like a suggestion than a wall. These aren't gradual transitions. Drive 3 hours in any direction and you're in a different America. Texas covers 268,000 square miles, second only to Alaska. You can drive for 12 hours straight without leaving the state. At that scale, regional variation isn't surprising. What's surprising is that it all functions as a single state, governed by the same legislature, following the same laws, waving the same flag. A rancher near Amarillo and a shrimper near Galveston live under the same state constitution, but their daily lives share almost nothing in common. The contradictions that would tear most places apart somehow hold together here. But the biggest difference between Texas and every other state isn't geography or energy or culture. It's who lives there now. In 2022, Texas reached a demographic milestone no other large state has hit. The Hispanic population equaled the non-Hispanic white population, both hovering around 12 million people. Texas became the first major state with true demographic parity, and the trends show no sign of reversing. This isn't recent migration or sudden demographic shift. It's the continuation of patterns that began when Texas was still part of Mexico. The Tejano families who fought at San Jacinto, the Vaqueros who invented cowboy culture, the communities along the Rio Grande that predate Anglo settlement, they never left. They just kept growing while the rest of the state grew around them. But here's what makes this politically explosive. Texas's 4 largest cities, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin, all lean liberal. Blue cities inside a red state with a rapidly diversifying suburban ring that nobody quite knows how to predict. Migration compounds the uncertainty. Californians priced out of the Bay Area moved to Austin, bringing tech money and progressive politics. New Yorkers fleeing high taxes settle in Dallas suburbs. Illinois families relocate to Houston. Each wave of domestic migration brings voters whose political habits were formed somewhere else. The Texas Demographic Center projects the state will reach 42.6 million people by 2060, a 37% increase from today. And more, that growth depends on migration. And that brings us to the question that keeps political strategists up at night. Texas holds 40 electoral votes, second only to California. For more than a generation, those votes have been reliably Republican. Every electoral math scenario for conservative presidential candidates runs through Texas. Without it, no realistic path to 270 exists. Lose Texas, and Republicans would need to flip multiple blue states just to stay competitive. If Texas turns blue, it ends Republican electoral dominance for a generation. The entire map of American politics redraws overnight. Suddenly, California and Texas, the 2 largest states, would pull in the same direction. The electoral math that has defined presidential politics since the Reagan era would simply stop working. The Texas Demographic Center states it plainly. More and more, Texas growth will depend on the level of migration. Migration will be the major driver of either growth or decline in the future. The same forces building modern Texas, domestic migration, demographic change, urban expansion into formerly rural counties, are the forces that could flip it. Nobody knows exactly when or if that happens. Hispanic voters don't behave as predictably democratic as some analysts assumed a decade ago. Migrants from blue states sometimes shift their politics after arriving, drawn to Texas precisely because it's different from where they left. Suburban voting patterns remain volatile nationwide, swinging with each election cycle. The projections suggesting purple by the 2000s and 30s and potentially blue by the 2000s and 40s depend on variables that nobody can fully control or predict. But the trajectory is clear enough to make Texas the most watched state in American politics for the foreseeable future. Every election, both parties pour resources into Texas, not always expecting to win, but probing for weakness, testing whether this is finally the year the dam breaks. Texas is the opposite of every U.S. state because it never stopped being what it was before it joined. A hybrid, a contradiction, a place that defies categorization. It's the South and the Southwest. It's fossil fuels and renewables. It's Mexican heritage wearing American mythology. It's red politics governing blue cities. It's cowboys who are actually vaqueros and roughnecks who now also build wind farms. The Lone Star isn't just attitude, it's the flag of a republic that became a state but never quite became ordinary. Other states have flags. Texas has a national flag it agreed to share. The contradictions aren't accidents. They're the legacy of a place that negotiated its entry into the Union as a sovereign equal, that built its economy on resources other states can't match, that absorbed wave after wave of migration without ever losing the cultural threads that made it distinct. Every energy policy, every demographic trend, every cultural symbol traces back to decisions made when Texas was still its own nation. Every paradox traces back to the same root. Texas was a country before it was a state, and some part of it never forgot. Now that state sits at the hinge of American politics, American energy, and American demographic change. 40 electoral votes hang in the balance. Billions of barrels of oil and gigawatts of wind power flow from the same landscape. 12 million Hispanic Texans and 12 million non-Hispanic white Texans share a state that was Mexican before it was American. What happens when the opposite state tips? That's the question the next 50 years will answer. If you want to see how geography shaped another state's strange story, watch one of the videos on screen now. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We've got a lot more ground to cover.